We now welcome back Vincent Medley, who is going to discuss managed intake myth busting.
Thank you. Is it on? Can you hear me? Yes. Oh. So thank you for having me back. I have a little bit more energy. I feel the jet lag is starting to wear off. And also, I'm glad I am back up here because I feel the need to redeem myself. And not for this morning's presentation, but for the fact that I was talking to one of our fellow conferencees out during tea time. And I was brave enough to admit to her that I once had an opportunity to hang out with Mel B from the Spice Girls. I didn't know who she was at the time. This was a long time ago. You can check my Facebook, there's pictures of it. I didn't know who she was, and when she asked me if I knew who she was, I told her I thought her name, that she was Cinnamon Spice. So, which I found out later is not even a Spice Girls member. So I feel the need to redeem myself for that very poor performance out during tea time. And you know, I also feel like animal welfare, we are at a point where we too have performed poorly in a couple of areas. And this is why this topic of managed intake is so important, because when I look at how we have treated the people in our community and why managed intake is so important, I start to realize that we have typecast people in a way that drives animals into the shelter. We have a really cute saying. How many of you believe in preserving the human-animal bond? I believe in it. The problem is, as formerly working for a government, I was one of the people, and all of you that work in a government, that tampered with the human-animal bond to begin with. You have the laws. We have society that tells us that certain people should have animals. Oh, a person that doesn't have a home, they should not have an animal. Although that's how we all started, out about with our animal without a house. We also believe stuff like, friendly cats can't live outside. A lot of us are part of that group. I was trained to believe that, like you're abandoning a cat outside. Let me ask you a question. Where were cats before 1965 when kitty litter was commonly used and commercially used? Where were they? Some of y'all need to quit acting like you don't know where those cats were. They were living outside. And all of us, and we even had TV shows. There was one TV show called That Darn Cat. And the cat would run in the house and it would run back out the house. You left the milk on the stoop for the cat. You didn't have him inside cuddling with you. Although there's nothing wrong with that. My cat, Mr. Pete, loves to eat his gravy and sit inside and criticize me all day. But that's different than what I'm talking about when it comes to the large number of the animals that are being driven into the shelters. So these are some of the reasons why managed intake is so important. You already know who I am. If you don't, you can come catch me during tea time where I can tell you another weird story, or definitely when it's time to get to have a drink or two in the evening, you can definitely get the details of that Mel B night. But so when we look at for us, it's really important for us to understand the data behind why we are doing what we do, why we are doing what we do, and why certain things like managed intake is important. There's a lot of misconceptions about managed intake. I'm not going to get into the public criticism of it, but I will tell you what it is so that you have a really clear idea of why we believe in it and why we think it's important, and why it's something that you can implement without it being something that the public looks at as you closing the doors on animals, because that is not what it is at all. Anybody who tells you that, they're not practicing it properly. So in one of the studies, some of the data we collected, we found that about 60% of straight intake, the person in about 60% of the straight intake, the person who picked up the animal did not live where they found it. And so you're taking an animal out of a community, as you're passing through. You see an animal on the side of the road, you make assumptions. When I worked on the Indian reservation, I knew that if I saw an animal, that it was going to wander itself back home. And when I was an animal management officer, or in the States we call it animal control or animal services officer, I could chase that animal back to its house, and then that would get the animal back to its owner, and then I could talk to the owner about whatever I needed to speak to him about. But a lot of times a Good Samaritan won't do that. They're just going to, and then also at the time, 60% of found animals who were later returned home were found within a mile of their home. So that means so imagine if which most shelters are put in place, kind of like a remote area next to solid waste treatment facility, or not solid waste, but a waste treatment facility, or in a warehouse area, or somewhere 12 miles past where Jesus lost his sandals, and and so you can't find it. So you've taken that animal, and the owner has to follow you and figure out where your shelter is, if they even know it exists, because we're not good at that either, and then get their animal if they have the time to. And a lot of the people that we're talking about are people that are working, that have other obligations, we've made a big inconvenience, and now we've kidnapped their animal and we've taken them to our shelter to take care of them until we have a moment to pay enough attention to them to either get them adopted out, rehomed in some other way, or transferred out, or euthanized. Our next step is the relationship between the stats and our demographics data is the pattern more common in lower income neighborhoods. Just keep that in mind. The people that are most extremely affected are people that are of lower income. Let me ask you a question. How many of you, because I've had an elected official or one of your city officials that are higher up say to you, in the case of a rich person, are you really sure you want to take that person's dog or keep it? We don't want that fight. That person has means. They can fight this case. Whereas the poorer people who don't have the time, don't have the access, they're the ones who the system is going to be the most cruel to. And it's our job for us to remove the system from them in as many cases as possible. It's not always possible, but it is possible with the rich person. You don't even have to do anything, change a law, change anything. So we should provide that same access to people, but standardize it in a way that provides the least amount of harm to pets and their families. One of the things we look at is return to home rates. And as far as return to home rates versus the shelter, the shelter is the last place an animal should be. Sometimes, with the exception of the pig that currently resides in Cabot, Arkansas with my friend Mike, who is the happiest individual I've ever seen anywhere and is currently in the shelter. Most of the time, the shelter is not a good place for anybody. Not you, not the pet, anybody. But when we look at the comparisons, 30% of animals that were returned to home by the finders were returned in the community, and then and only 10% of the animals that enter the shelter are ones that actually found their way home. And then ultimately, finders assisted to increase the number of reunifications in their community by just under 50%. That's a high rate. What are we talking about? We're talking about keeping families together, and the pet is part of the family. And we're also continuing to keep that bond that we all said that we are very much in support of, and the joy within the community. Do you know the harm that it causes somebody that when they no longer have a family member? Just imagine, for those of you who can't imagine it from the standpoint of having your animal taken, imagine when your pet passed away. It's very similar. How the hurt and the harm that you felt just from that traumatic incident. And so this is what we're talking about. This is why we're looking at this data, and we're looking at it so hard. And so that was out of 3,500 intakes in our pilot shelters that we, over 4,000 that we that we looked at in our pilot shelters. Also, if you look at our municipal organizations, the intake breakdown from 2019 to 2021, this is why this is so important. Intake is extremely important in understanding the coding upon intake. We had 60% of, over 60% of the animals were strays, which were reported as we don't know who the pet owner belongs to, or who the pet belongs to for the most part. And then 24% were owner surrenders, and 12% were other types of intake. And a lot of that has to do with poor coding and just knowing that the animal was taken in, but the coding may not have existed. And the reason why this graph is important is because a lot of what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about are things that are preventable, things that we can intervene on before the animal gets to the shelter, especially when you talk about owner intake and the misunderstanding that an animal is a stray, when a lot of times we mix the two terms, like stray, meaning an animal straying in the city is the same as an animal that doesn't have an owner. A lot of these animals are lost, or they've wandered away from their home and their owner does not know that they're even gone, or sometimes they do and they just feel like the animal should be able to run free. But there's no reason, even if they do believe that, to take the animal out of the community. So I understand this, and we understand this at HASA. We deal with a lot of conflicting voices in the community. Like the same community that is wanting you to stop euthanizing animals are the same. Their next door neighbor is the one that called about the animal that is running loose. So I do recognize that you have a job to do, a lot of you that work for municipalities, to go out and investigate. But one of the things that I really emphasize is, we play with the toys the gods give us. That's what I always tell my people when I train them. And when I started, the gods gave me a ticket book, they gave me a truck, and they gave me a pole and a rope. So I used the gods' tools, and I paid tribute to the gods by taking as many animals off of people's property and writing as many citations as possible. The problem is, that resulted in the death of a bunch of animals. And that's something I have to live with on a daily basis. It also resulted in the people being locked up for very minor things. Your pet doesn't have a tag. You decided that you weren't going to go to court and answer to the judge. The judge issues a warrant, and then the next thing you know, you're in jail next to the guy that cut somebody's head off because your dog didn't have a license. And you might happen to be 80 years old. I mean, that could actually happen. That's a true story. And I've got a lot of stories. I don't want to bore you with it because I'm trying to stay upbeat this morning or before lunch. I don't want to give you a Debbie Downer. So some of the barriers in animal welfare, if you look at some of the barriers we have to deal with on a daily basis that we've got to really work at, and all of the people in this room can be a part of this, and this is why the Human Animal Supports Project exists. One of the reasons is, number one, some of the barriers we have right now are policy. I'll give you a quick example. When I would pick an animal up when I started in 1999, they told me, if the owner comes, do not take that animal off the truck, because people are going to say they paid you or that you know them, so you bring that animal directly to the shelter. When I could have just let the animal off the truck, and that animal would be back with its family. In this case, you got to have a fenced yard as one of your rules. And so if you don't have a fenced yard, that barrier pulls an animal into the shelter rather than you help and provide some type of support to that person that would help them keep their animal on their property. Processes that are confusing and overly cumbersome, where people reading. So for instance, your volunteer program, that's a barrier. If you're having to undergo several trainings a month in order to maintain your volunteer status, things like that. Your foster caregiver must schedule appointments. There's no exceptions. You've got to meet all appointments. Otherwise, you got to bring the animal back. You're irresponsible foster. Also, in terms of reclaim fees and fines, somebody asked me this question on the app about, what type of fees would you charge for animal intake, or not what kind, but do you advocate for it? And the reality is that a lot of these fees and fines, number one, they don't recoup the money. You are throwing money down. You are keeping the animal in the shelter is going to throw money down the drain, because you are incurring costs every second that animal is there. And then also rules that require separation from people to get help. We don't provide the example is we don't provide care to owned animals. You either surrender your pet or you pay the vet to care for it. Those are your options. Also, lengthy applications that are deterrent. One thing that in the United States we're finding is the breeders are beating the hell out of us because they don't have the same barriers that you do. And so the animal that could be occupying, the animal from your shelter that could be occupying a loving family's home is being occupied by a breeder's pet because those barriers were not there for them. Being rude and disrespectful. How many times have we been nasty or looked at people? We have an article in one of our blogs on our website called "Animal Welfare Has a Cruelty to People Problem." And the reality is how many times do we judge people because we feel like that they are not worthy of an animal? And then also a lack of easily accessible information to all people in the different languages, understanding the languages in your community and being connected with that, and also the having people access information in the way that they access it rather than deciding how they access it and then being that roadblock. Like for instance, not everybody has a phone to use the internet. So how are you reaching the people that don't? Description of pets and people that are derogatory, subjective, and unkind, and restrictions based on those descriptions. The example in this case is she's your basic pit bull and should only be adopted to an experienced pit bull owner because these dogs have behavioral issues. In terms of this is the myth, fact versus myth page for managed intake. The myth about managed intake is that sick and injured dogs and cats will be turned out onto the streets, and the reality is that incoming pets calls about pets will be given the incoming dogs and cats will be given the assessment they need, and they will also, we would determine a pathway for them once they get into the shelter. People in underserved communities will be, one of the myths is, will be discriminated against and unfairly left behind with this model. And the reality is that this model is based, whether you're publicly or privately funded, has the systems that have been known to discriminate against marginalized people. The current system unfairly leaves people without the same means, and also one of the primary objectives of this model and one of the reasons for this creation is to be inclusive. Another stereotype is stray. Healthy pets will be turned away from the shelter, and that couldn't be further from the truth because we find that people who've lost their pet will be given support to find the owner if they're willing, if they find a lost pet, they'll be given the support to find the owner. And if they can't find the owner and they aren't able to hold the pet, then the shelter takes the pet in. The finder also is required to hold on to the animal. This is a myth. Hold on to the animal and are responsible for finding the owners themselves, and that's not true because with our pet support services and our pet reunification programs, we're able to provide that person with resources that will help them find that animal. So we're talking whether it's on social media or resources we have and applications that we use at the shelter. We have resources for them to help reunify that pet with their owner. And then all lost pets won't be at the shelter where the owners come find them. The vast majority of the owners do not come to the shelter to look for their animal for a number of reasons. We already know you're going to get fined, you're going to get talking to, you might get a citation, they may not even have time. So where's the best place for that animal to be rehomed? I mean, not rehomed, but reunified with their home is in the community. And that's why we ask the community to support. And then there's also the organization that I officially work for through the Maddie's Fund grant and a few other executives at that organization are working in a silo that we are out of touch, which couldn't be further from the truth, because our project actually encompassed over 30 municipalities, over 300 animal welfare professionals, and they covered organizations like Pet Finder, Michelson Fund, Michelson Found Animals, Maddie's Fund, Pedigree, and many, many more. The Humane Society of the United States, Best Friends, we covered them all. The reality is that our model, the managed intake model, is a support and resource model, and also those who wish to judge need not apply for a job in a actual managed intake shelter. Because when you take a let's take a look at this infographic here. So this lady comes in and she wants to surrender her animal, and that's all we see. But you can imagine some of the stereotypes that we have. There's so many, when people walk in the door, what we say about people. Oh, they're just throwing it away like it's trash. Or, you know, she didn't deserve an animal to begin with. You know the number of things that are said about people. Why did you have an animal if you couldn't afford one? And the reality is that in this woman's case, it was because of COVID. It was during COVID. She lost her job and she no longer has the income. And I will tell you what, COVID was bad in some senses. Well, it was in a lot of senses. But what was worse is post-COVID, when all the safety nets were gone. And I guess not even post-COVID, COVID recovery. All the safety nets are gone, all the moratoriums are gone, and landlords can evict people left and right, people who had a safety net at their job, and businesses that were relying on certain funding to keep and maintain their payroll no longer were able to do that. A lot of people lost their job. And that's why this young lady has come in to give up her animal. And then also, the services don't exist, and we were not prepared for COVID recovery. Just like we weren't prepared when we were doing so well with intake decreasing, and intake and live outcomes increasing. We didn't know why they were doing it. We were just happy that it was happening, and we weren't prepared for what would happen when the music stopped. And then also, in our new model, we connect people with extra help so families can stay together. And you see this young woman who was distraught at the beginning is now very happy. She's not at the shelter anymore. She's at home. That's the couch. Her and her pet are happy as can be. Some other things to take that we consider when we talk about managed intake is it's really a community-oriented model, and these are some of the reasons why you should be very much encouraging and promoting people knowing their neighbor, and you yourself knowing your neighbor. And some of the reasons are really easy, because I'll give you an example. My neighbor, when I lived in Philadelphia, she had a medical emergency, obviously out of the blue. It was the middle of the night. I knew she had a pet, so I went over next door, and as she was leaving, I told her, I was like, Mo, don't worry about it. I got your dog until you get out of the hospital. that's way better than it going into a shelter. And that's a really easy reason as to why we should know our neighbors. The same for you. Your neighbor can check. Like I have neighbors now that I live in New Mexico. If there's an issue at my house, I can call them and say, hey, can you check and see so-and-so? And I have a neighbor whose dogs are constantly out. And when they don't try to bite me, I put them back in their yard. I got one, little Mercury. Mercury is he's like a little crocodile. And so, those are some of the reasons. Also, when a person experiences a crisis and can't care for their pet, in our old system, it was once again punitive to the person. The pet has to go and be sent to the shelter till the person gets out the hospital. But remember, especially in the United States, if your dog goes into the shelter, maybe it's mandatorily needs to be spayed or neutered, desexed, or it might need to, a rabies vaccination might be required. So in order for you to get your animal out after you've had this crisis, you've got to jump through these hoops and pay these fines or pay these fees. And then also in the new system though, what you're looking at is the person in crisis gets their animal, they get back on their feet and the animal's returned to them with zero barriers. Real quick, some really quick terms to think about when it comes to managed intake and the resources it takes to run a managed intake program. Obviously, Human Animal Support Services, we have a really big website that can provide you with a lot of information. Ecosystem mapping, understanding the needs in your community and what your community wants, knowing the communities in which your animals, the pets, where pets live and the ones you serve most often, what the gap is between the community and the services that are needed in the community. And by services, I'm not talking about animal services. I'm talking about services that you can provide to keep the animals into the shelter. We call field services a service, and it can be a service because I believe that the animal management officer is the best outreach team in animal welfare. But it's like I said earlier, we play with the toys the gods give us. If you give them ticket books and ropes and poles and traps, those are the toys they're going to play with. If you provide them with programs and resources, those also are and you hire the type of personality that is going to be most likely to use those things, now you're talking about a whole different concept and a whole different type of person and a whole different service that you're providing. They can doing that will take your programs and services way farther than even a really well set up program, because you have people and their talents that are willing to take those things as far as they can go. Social service area, we talked about that, understanding the service area and what areas are the most likely to get service, because those areas that are most likely to get service are the ones that the system is probably going to slam the most. Social vulnerability index, social vulnerability, and socially vulnerable populations. I know that's a lot of socials, but the reality is that all of these things are really important. And notice these aren't legally vulnerable populations; these are socially vulnerable populations. We all have control over what we can do to help people socially, and then also things like census tract data. We talked a little bit about ecosystem mapping. I am so in love with ecosystem mapping because by creating it, it's the creation of spreadsheets and visual maps detailing community providers relevant to the project in a service area, and the communities wishing to improve animal services will utilize the IDEA ecosystem template to map the existing community support, to support that ecosystem. And the reason why this is important, and I'm not talking that much about managed intake, is because the reality is the more we know about our community, the less managed intake is a factor and the less of an issue there is. Real quick, we did a survey of our 5 shelters, over 400 animals, and as you can see, the number of dogs and cats is about even, and then there were other, which is probably wildlife and other livestock possibly, and then also some of the intake reasons, and these are the things I said earlier, are ones that are reasons that that are preventable. That the animal is strayed, do we know that for sure? Owner surrender, there's many owner surrender reasons that we could intervene on, and then also adoption returns. Did we make the correct match in the beginning, but also did we set that person up to succeed? And also trial adoption returns, we had a small percentage of those, and those are a lot of times the foster to adopt programs. When we looked at some of the reasons, the animal was not a fit in term, or there was a housing issue or a behavior issue. In terms of, or there was, in certain situations, there was no time, the person was overwhelmed, also not a good fit. And as you can see across the board, the information is similar based on, and it's not necessarily based on the type of breed or the animal. It's just a lot of times people are dealing with the exact same things, and if we could address those underlying issues, we could really keep a lot of animals out of the shelter. And then also the reasons varied based on the shelter. As you can see, no adoptions returned were captured for one of our, and that was the sick, ill, or sick or injury, urgent medical. Those animals obviously a lot of times need to come in to the shelter. But as you can see, again, behavior is all over this, and then also not a good fit. And digging deeper and understanding the reasons why, that's why why intake reasons are so important. Why the animal is not a good fit is also something that, from a data point, you want to take a deeper look at rather than look at it from the surface. What are the problems we're trying to solve? The lack of accessible information, and also the dependency on the public dependency of the public as a shelter for all needs. When you look at our one last survey we have, is 71% of all owners wanted but could not find or afford access or access services as shown here, and they run the gamut between veterinary care, microchipping, emergency vet care. All of these things are factors in why animals get brought into the shelter and never leave the shelter, and why managed intake is so important. And then also some of our guiding principles is every animal in the community should have access to services and resources. Every community member should be a clear and equitable and accessible, have a accessible pathway to services. And then also through managed intake, we continue to identify gaps in the community. It gives us the time to do that regarding resources and services for the animal caretakers, because managed intake is a program, not just an isolated policy. And so keep that in mind as well. With that, I will go. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vincent. And I'll invite our speakers from this morning to come up and sit at the question panel. I don't know if anyone else is like me when listening to so many of these presentations, but particularly Vincent's just now, when I cringe and I think that was me. I was the one that upheld those outdated frameworks about who could adopt animals, or, you know, people surrendering animals and not being able to take them back. And it makes me feel a bit awful. But then I reminded of the quote that Jackie put up yesterday, which was, to paraphrase, at the time I did what I thought was best. When I knew better, I did better. And I guess what this is all about, sharing these ideas and making sure that we're aware of best practice and going back and putting that into play. So question time. The first question is for Cindy from Amanda. In your where did it go? There it is. In your presentation paper on Hoover, you have cats in shoreline cages. Do you feel that these are better than the condos that are becoming more prevalent in Australia? When building housing for dogs, should both sides be the same size, or should one side be larger than the other? And can we just scroll that up, please? They're jumping. Or should one side be larger than the other? For example, the bed retreat side smaller than the other play interaction recreation side. So I guess two parts to that question. The first one about the cat shoreline versus the condo, and then the dog housing.
Is this on?
Yes.
I feel like a lounge singer. Okay. We do like the shoreline cages, and when I say we, our program, but most importantly, it's that both sides are quite large. I do not mean to throw shade on anyone manufacturing the condos, but what we tend to see is the multi-compartment where you have one large and then a couple of smaller ones. The smaller compartments aren't enough for the cats. You'll notice they're not able to posture appropriately when you have the shelf, and so we really do prefer, and it's easier to get the minimum size if you have two large sizes. It's also important to think about what the condos are made of. Stainless steel lasts a really long time. Sometimes when you use some of the laminate products, if you're in a humid environment, they're just not going to last you as long. So not surprisingly, I'll be talking about housing again tomorrow when I'm talking about cat flu. I know stainless steel cannot look as great. It is loud, but there's ways that we can mitigate that. So yes, our program recommends stainless steel, two larger compartments for cat housing. That is the recommendation that we have. I am not trying to offend anyone who makes housing, but I would also love to talk to you about some tweaks we could do to it. As far as dogs, that really depends. On the dog, it is nice to have a smaller area where you can kind of set it up to feel a little bit more cozy. I mean, a great thing would be that you could build some variety into your housing, where some of them would be two large compartments, and then you'd have some where it was smaller and larger. Bottom line, though, the most important thing is that it is multiple compartment. Please don't ask your dogs to have to go to the bathroom in the same place that they have to sleep and eat. That is exceptionally stressful for the dogs. So I would say it depends on the sizes, but they have to have multiple compartments.
Thank you, Cindy. This is a question for Vincent from Sue. How do we get our councils to engage with owners looking to surrender instead of taking the easy route and just transporting the animal to the shelter?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think part of it is to be helpful by seeking out and providing solutions for the community. There were so many programs in different governments I worked in that even when I first proposed them to my supervisor or to a member of the government, they were like, no, we're not doing that. And, I would turn around and leave their office and tell my team, we're doing that. And so the next thing you know, the next year, it's like, oh my goodness, this is a great program. It's provided us so much, entrails into the community. But I also feel like one of the things that you could do to get the government support is to take them to the areas where you are having some of the biggest issues, and out on some of those cases to see firsthand and what the solution is. They need to understand it on the ground floor. And so these are human beings. When you're behind a desk, it's a number. But when you get out there and you see and you start making the connections, especially with our project, which is not only is this person somebody who needs support for their pet, but they're also the person that needs some social service help, that need a nonprofit agency. A lot of the resources we use, we can combine and synergize. The other thing I would say too is to demonstrate the cost savings of using these programs rather than bringing the animal into the shelter. A lot of us, Dr. Karsten and I were talking about this yesterday, we don't run the numbers. You are hemorrhaging money by picking up animals and housing them in your shelter. You just haven't done the math. So what you don't know is really killing your organization in terms of money, but you haven't done the math. So I would say definitely do your homework and speak their languages as spreadsheets, money, and then also provide the human story. Also, don't go into somebody's office just talking about animals. They're going to think you're crazy, because a lot of them have different priorities within the government. Animals is not their top priority. Talk to them and understand what's important to them, and speak to them. Don't go in some person that's really hawkish about the budget. Don't go in there talking about animals. Talk to them about the cost saving. So suit your argument to your audience. And Mike Wheeler, I'm going to keep referring to him, is an expert at that. I think I've been very effective at it. And we also have tools on the Haas website that could help you with that as well. And I could hook you up with some of our policy people that can help you as well to make some of those arguments.
And maybe take some donuts. And finally, a question for Brian from Amanda. What timeline do you recommend to an organisation that is looking to build a large shelter, 250 dogs, 400 cats, from the start of planning, site acquisition, build, troubleshooting, moving in, and then moving into open operations? So broadly, let's say there are no pandemic interruptions or, natural disasters. Broadly, what is the sort of time frame you'd be looking at for that?
2 years. Thank you. Seriously, though, it is usually around 2 years from the time that you have commitment to move forward with the project. It's, there's a funding pathway, you have land available, so it's about 2 years to get through the planning process, design, approvals, and construction. That's a pretty good average time frame. It can be expedited, but really only for small projects or refits, but usually it's around 2 years. Good.
Fantastic. Thanks, Brian. Don't forget that you can ask your questions directly to the speakers on the Hoover app as well, because we only have such limited time with the panel. So a big thank you to our presenters from this session.